On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 took off for a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Tokyo to Osaka, Japan. 12 minutes after takeoff, the Boeing 747 experienced a severe structural failure and flew under minimal control for a terrifying 32 minutes before crashing in the area of Mount Takamagahara. The aircraft was carrying 524 people, including 15 crew members. The crash killed all the crew members and 505 passengers, leaving just 4 survivors, although it is believed 20 to 50 passengers survived the initial impact, but died a few hours later due to a delay in rescuers reaching the crash site. The crash remains the single deadliest aircraft accident in aviation history. In this video, we will look at the terrifying moments before the incident, what caused its catastrophic failure, and how 4 people managed to survive. Every August in Japan, millions of people celebrate Obon, a holiday that pays tribute to their ancestors. During this time, families usually travel to their ancestral homes, causing a significant travel rush for domestic airline flights. In 1985, Obon fell around August the 15th, and by August 12th, the holiday travel rush was already underway. To accommodate the overwhelming number of travelers, Japan Airlines typically utilized long-haul aircraft, including the Boeing 747, on very short domestic flights. One such route was from Tokyo to Osaka, Japan's second largest city. On August the 12th, Japan Airlines Flight 123 was one of the many flights between these two cities. The aircraft scheduled to operate Flight 123 that day was JA8119, a Boeing 747 SR manufactured in 1974. The 747 SR was a model designed by Boeing specifically for Japan Airlines to use on its short-haul domestic flights. Compared to a normal 747, the SR had a stronger fuselage and tougher landing gear designed to withstand a great number of takeoffs, landings, and pressurization cycles. Unfortunately, JA8119 had a history of trouble. In June 1978, while landing in Osaka as Japan Airlines Flight 115, the pilot patched up too steeply during touchdown, causing the tail to strike the runway. This resulted in major damage to various parts of the aircraft, and several passengers were injured. The plane was eventually safely landed, but was rendered unserviceable and required extensive repairs. JA8119 was ferried to a Japan Airlines heavy maintenance facility in Tokyo, where it underwent a month's worth of intensive reconstruction. Boeing engineers determined that due to the severity of the damage, much of the bottom part of the aft pressure bulkhead needed to be replaced. A new portion of the bulkhead was fabricated, and it was supposed to be bolted to the remaining part of the original one by 2 rows of rivets. However, during installation, it was discovered that the overlap at the joint between the new and the original portion was insufficient. To resolve this problem, the engineers decided to put a metal splice plate in between the overlapping edges that they secured with 3 rows of rivets. The bottom row of rivets would pass through the splice plates and into the lower skin section. The middle row would pass through the upper skin section, the splice plate, and the lower skin section and the uppermost row would connect the upper skin section, the splice plate, and one of the radial stiffeners. Both the upper and lower skin sections should have been attached to the splice plate by 2 rows of rivets. However, a mistake was made during the repair. Over part of the joint between the 2 skin sections, the splice plate only overlapped the bottom 2 of the 3 rows of rivets. The uppermost row of rivets connected the upper skin section directly to the stiffener with a filler plate in between, without intersecting the splice plate. Unfortunately, even though the work was inspected by a Boeing engineer, the mistake was not detected because it had been covered up by a fillet seal. Only using one row of rivets where two were required reduced the strength of the joint by 70%, and with the bulkhead being under extreme pressure whenever the passenger cabin was pressurized, it was only a matter of time before the joint failed. On that fateful day, Flight 123 was on its 12,319th flight since it had been repaired. The flight was almost fully booked, with 509 of the plane's 520 passenger seats occupied. Along with the 3 pilots and 12 flight attendants, a total of 524 people were on board. The crew consisted of Captain Masami Takahama, a 49-year-old experienced instructor captain with 12,400 flight hours, who would be sitting in the first officer's seat since he was training the 39-year-old first officer Yutaka Sasaki to become a captain. The cockpit crew was completed by 46-year-old flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda. Under the control of First Officer Sasaki, Flight 123 took off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport at 1812 local time, en route to Osaka. The flight was expected to take just 54 minutes at a cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. 12 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft approached its cruising altitude, the pressure differential became too great for the aft pressure bulkhead to handle, and the bulkhead ruptured along the joint between the repaired section and the original bulkhead, causing cabin air to gush out with tremendous force, shattering the bulkhead into several pieces. Within seconds of the failure, a pressure wave violently tore off a large section of the plane's tail, including the tail cone, vertical stabilizer, rudder, auxiliary power unit, and other crucial structural components and control systems. In the cockpit, the pilots heard a loud noise and felt the sudden decompression. Anything not secured in the cabin, including papers, napkins, and magazines, propelled towards the hole in the back of the plane, as the water vapor in the air instantly condensed the cabin filled with white fog. As soon as the plane experienced explosive decompression, oxygen masks fell from the cabin ceiling, and an automatic announcement instructed passengers on how to use them. Flight attendants and Yumi Ochai, an off-duty flight attendant, rushed to assist passengers in putting on their masks. Captain Takahama immediately switched the transponder to broadcast code 7700, the universal emergency signal, and called Tokyo Air Traffic Control to announce an emergency and request a return to Haneda Airport. However, flight engineer Fukuda noticed a bigger problem. The aircraft was losing hydraulic pressure. This was because all 4 hydraulic systems ran through the tail, and when the rudder control units and the APU fell off, all 4 hydraulic systems were severed, and the hydraulic fluid quickly leaked out. As the hydraulic pressure began to slip away, First Officer Sasaki found it difficult to maintain the correct bank angle while turning back towards the airport, and the aircraft entered a phugoid cycle, which is a cycle of up and down movements. As if that wasn't bad enough, the plane also started Dutch rolling. The passengers must have been absolutely terrified as the plane violently plunged up and down, rolling around as the crew desperately tried to stabilize it. Sadly, their efforts were futile. With all the hydraulic fluid gone, their controls were completely ineffective. In the chaos, the pilots failed to put on their oxygen masks, and as a result, they began to suffer from hypoxia, a lack of oxygen. The plane continued to hurtle along at an altitude of between 20 to 25,000 feet, but because the pilots' brains were deprived of oxygen, it was making it difficult for them to comprehend what was happening and what they needed to do. The air traffic controller was confused as to why the flight was not turning back towards Haneda Airport and suggested to the crew he could guide them into Nagoya Airport instead. However, the pilots declined, insisting that they were returning to Haneda. At this point, the controller noticed that the crew was struggling to communicate clearly in English. This was likely due to hypoxia, so they allowed the conversation to switch to Japanese. Despite the low levels of oxygen, the pilots were able to make adjustments to the engine power, which resulted in a reduction of the phugoid cycle, and flight engineer Fukada contacted Japan Airlines for advice. He noticed an indicator signaling that the rearmost exit door on the right side was open and thought that it could be the reason for their difficulties. He told them, "Listen, the R5 door has broken. We are descending right now." Sadly, the situation was much more serious and descent was not possible, and the aircraft continued to oscillate between 20,000 and 22,000 feet, moving further and further away from any major airports. In a desperate attempt to stabilize the flight path, Fukuda lowered the landing gear, which reduced the pitching motion but made it harder to control the Dutch roll. The action was quickly reversed. The pilots eventually initiated a right turn towards Haneda using differential thrust, but once they started turning right, they couldn't stop it, and the aircraft did a steep 360-degree descending loop over the town of Otsuki, losing around 5,000 feet in the process. The terrified passengers would have caught sight of Mount Fuji looming closer as they looked out of the windows. A person on the ground who was listening to the air traffic control frequency became aware of an emergency situation, and Japanese television channels interrupted their regularly scheduled programming to report that a Boeing 747 was in distress. One station even connected live via telephone to a man who was observing the plane from the ground in real time as it flew near Mount Fuji. Flight 123 was in real trouble. The pilot struggled to regain control and briefly managed to steer the plane before it slipped into a left turn and climbed steeply. The air traffic control asked if they had regained control, but the pilots responded that the plane was uncontrollable. Suddenly, the plane entered another terrifying dive, losing thousands of feet in less than a minute. Captain Takahama shouted to his fellow crew that the situation was hopeless and they were in danger of hitting the mountains. The plane fell to an altitude of just 5,000 feet, lower than the surrounding summits. The 747 climbed back to 8,000 feet, but the speed loss during the climb triggered the stick shaker, which warned of an immediate stall. Captain Takahama yelled to increase power to prevent the plane from stalling, and the pilots fought to prevent the aircraft from descending into the mountains, but they couldn't regain control. They attempted to match the inputs for throttles and flaps to increase and decrease drag, speed and lift, but the engine and flaps reacted too slowly. For several terrifying minutes, the pilots struggled to keep the plane from crashing. The air traffic controller in Tokyo informed the crew that their location was 102 kilometers northwest of Tokyo. Flight 123 acknowledged the message, and this was the final communication from the plane. The crew did not respond to any further transmissions. In the cabin, passengers prepared themselves in various ways for the inevitable impact. Flight attendants tried their best to keep people calm, but to no avail. At least one person took photographs of the inside of the plane, showing the oxygen masks hanging down over the crowded rows. Many passengers wrote notes to their loved ones on any paper they could find. Some of the notes read as follows: "The plane is turning around and descending rapidly. I am grateful for the happy life I have enjoyed until now. It's hard to believe that our dinner last night was the last time we ate together. Please take care of the children. I'm scared. Help me. I don't want to die." The crew fought until the very end, refusing to give up despite knowing their efforts were futile. The aircraft banked at a steep angle of 50 degrees to the right and disappeared behind a descending ridge of Mount Osaka. This was the last sighting of the plane. In the cockpit, Captain Takahama repeatedly shouted, "Raise the nose, apply more power." The plane began to pull out of the dive, but it was too late. The cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Takahama's final words. "It's the end." At 18:56 and 22 seconds, the right wingtip and number 4 engine struck trees and was sheared off. The plane continued forward and struck another ridge. Debris tumbled down the mountainside as the wing disintegrated, but the 747 kept going, rolling over as it hurtled more than 500 meters across a ravine before finally slamming upside down in another ridge before exploding. The burning debris was scattered over a vast area of the forest. After 32 minutes of terror, Japan Airlines Flight 123 was down. Air traffic controllers watched in horror as the 747 disappeared from their radar screens. The aircraft had gone down in a remote area, and a massive effort to locate the crash site began immediately. Around 25 minutes after the crash, a United States Air Force C-130 spotted the burning wreckage. Over the radio, one of the crew members said, "I doubt if there will be any survivors." This may have influenced what happened next, something that proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Believing that no one could have survived the crash, there was no immediate urgency in reaching the crash site that was inaccessible by road. In the absence of such urgency, local authorities organized the search themselves. The site had been pinpointed by a Japan Air Self-Defense Force helicopter, but unfortunately, there was nowhere to land, and they reported no signs of survivors. Another helicopter, belonging to the Nagano Prefecture Police, flew over the site at 5:37 a.m. the next day and reported similar findings. In the nearby village of Ueno, a massive ground operation was underway. The Japanese authorities mobilized at least 8,000 people, 880 vehicles, and 37 aircraft. However, it wasn't until 10 a.m. on the 13th of August that they reached the wreckage on foot. The scene that greeted them was nothing short of apocalyptic. Bodies and tangled wreckage was scattered everywhere, and they held little hope of finding anyone alive. However, as rescuers approached the remains of the tail section, one of them spotted a hand waving from amidst the wreckage. It was off-duty flight attendant Yumi Ochai. Miraculously, she had not only survived the crash, but also lived through 16 hours overnight on the mountain, waiting for rescuers. Just moments later, another miracle occurred, when 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami was found alive, hanging from the branches of a tree. She was the only survivor from her family of 4. 2 more survivors, 34-year-old Hiroko Yoshisaki and her 8-year-old daughter, Mikiko, were also found alive, but seriously injured. Crowds of friends and relatives gathered in the village of Ueno in the hope more survivors would be found. Sadly, that was not the case. There were just the 4 survivors, all of whom had been seated in the last 7 rows of the plane. The 4 survivors shared their harrowing stories of the crash. However, it was Yumi Ochai who gave the most chilling testimony of all. After describing the moments before the impact, when terrified passengers surrounded her, crying and frantically writing notes to their loved ones, she recalled how the plane dropped sharply and the cabin ripped apart around her as the tail section tumbled down the mountainside. After all the debris came to a stop, she found herself trapped between 2 collapsed seat rows, unable to move. As she lay there waiting to be rescued, Ochai could clearly hear many other passengers gasping for air and calling for help. She also heard the first helicopter that located the scene shortly after it crashed and frantically waved to it as it flew off, leaving her and the other survivors on the mountainside for a further 16 hours. During this time, Ochai clung to life as those survivors around her fell silent. The terrible truth is many more people had survived the accident, only to die on the mountainside, waiting to be rescued. Examinations by doctors confirmed Ochai's account and revealed that several of the victims appeared to have suffered injuries that would have been survivable if help had arrived sooner. Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission initiated a large-scale inquiry into the accident. However, they were not initially permitted to visit the site, and it took several weeks to start the investigation. However, from the start, it was clear that the problem occurred in the tail section of the 747, and it was sourced back to the faulty repair. Investigators conducted a series of simulator tests with representative crews to determine if a safe landing was possible under the same circumstances that occurred on Flight 123. However, despite having some prior knowledge of the nature of the emergency and without the additional factors such as noise, lack of oxygen, and fear of death, none of the 5 crews in the experiment were able to land the plane safely. Therefore, it was concluded that the crew of Flight 123 had no chance of making a safe landing, and they were doomed from the moment the bulkhead failed. If the bulkhead had been maintained and inspected properly, it would not have failed during the aircraft's lifetime. In the event of a bulkhead failure, the pressurized relief door inside the tail section was designed to open if pressurized air entered the tail, preventing it from exceeding the design limits of the aft fuselage. But in the case of Flight 123, this safety feature did not work because the hole caused by the faulty repair was so large that the air rushed through it too quickly, meaning the pressure relief door could not vacate the air fast enough to reduce the pressure. However, many of the victims' families and some experts dispute this, believing that maintenance errors may have prevented the pressure relief door from opening normally. In the wake of the investigation, a criminal investigation resulted in charges against 20 members of the repair team. However, the charges were dropped after Boeing refused to cooperate, citing the US policy of not charging aviation personnel involved in accidents unless there is intent to do harm. The lack of charges or an explanation of how such a catastrophic error in repair could occur has led to a belief among the Japanese public that although Boeing took the blame for the botched repair, it was to protect one of its best customers, Japan Airlines, who they believe was the real culprit. Despite Boeing taking the blame for the accident, it was Japan Airlines that bore the brunt of the fallout. The airline's CEO resigned immediately after the crash, and a Japan Airlines maintenance manager committed suicide soon after to apologize for the disaster. Bookings fell drastically, and airline employees suffered abuse from the public. It took years for the airline to recover financially, and public trust in the company still hasn't returned to its pre-disaster levels nearly 40 years later. The investigation is also accused of ignoring the mistakes made by Japanese authorities during the search and rescue operation. The official autopsy report listed the moment of impact as the time of death for all 520 victims, despite the survivors telling a different story. Make of that what you will. All we can say is our thoughts go out to the victims and families of a crash that should have never happened.